Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, April 27th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Zelensky holds a call with China's Xi Jinping. So, Ukrainian President Zelensky held a call with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday, marking the first time the two leaders spoke since Russia launched its invasion last year. On Twitter, Zelensky said the conversation was meaningful. Zelensky wrote, quote, "I had a long and meaningful phone call with President Xi Jinping. I believe that this call, as well as the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China, will give a powerful impetus to the development of our bilateral relations," end quote. So, according to a Chinese readout of the call, Xi expressed to Zelensky Beijing's position on the war and called for diplomacy. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said, quote, "President Xi pointed out that the Ukraine crisis is evolving in complex ways with major impacts on the international landscape. On the Ukraine crisis, China always stands on the side of peace. Its core stance is to facilitate talks for peace," end quote. So she emerged as a potential mediator between Zelensky and Putin after Beijing released a 12-point peace plan for the conflict in February. She told Zelensky during the call that China will, quote, "continue to facilitate talks for peace and make its efforts for early ceasefire and restoration of peace," end quote. So, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, this sounds like a positive development. China is going to send diplomats to Ukraine and other countries in the region to have, quote, "in depth communication with all parties on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis," end quote. So they said all parties. They didn't mention Russia by name, but it does sound like if they're sending diplomats to the region to talk to all parties, maybe they'll be talking to Russia and Ukraine as well. And the ministry added that Beijing has provided Ukraine with humanitarian assistance and will continue to do so. So the Biden administration has discouraged peace talks throughout the war, as I've covered quite a bit. And the White House came out against the ceasefire before she went to meet with Putin last month. They've really rejected this idea of China as a mediator. Despite that, though, the White House had positive things to say about the call on Wednesday. They said it was a good thing that she and Zelensky spoke. So this is National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He said, quote, "Now, whether that's going to lead to some sort of meaningful peace movement or plan or proposal, I just don't think we know that right away," end quote. It's definitely sounding more open to the idea than before. I think really just the PR of them saying they're against the ceasefire might have, led to them changing their tune a little bit. And Kirby was the one that said that, said a ceasefire was unacceptable. So over in Moscow, the Russian Foreign Ministry kind of threw cold water on the idea of China's efforts leading to peace talks. They said that the Ukrainian government, quote, "has been rejecting all reasonable initiatives aimed at finding a political and diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis," end quote. So hopefully these Chinese efforts bear some fruit. It's good at least that there are some people, just really pushing for diplomacy. And Zelensky, who knows what he's thinking, if he's actually genuinely open to these ideas or if he's just, thinking about future Chinese investments in Ukraine, post, during the reconstruction. It's not really clear yet, but we'll see how this all plays out. The next one here, speaking of bad PR, the U.S. envoy blasts Hungary's call for a Ukraine ceasefire as cynical. So this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. And this is the U.S. ambassador in Hungary attacked Budapest for insufficient commitment to the NATO proxy war against Russia. The ambassador claimed that supporting a ceasefire in Ukraine was cynical. So Ambassador to Hungary David Pressman made the remarks during the opening of the Hungary-Ukraine Relations panel on Wednesday. He said, quote, "It is cynical to call for a ceasefire when it is not your country that is almost 20% occupied by a foreign invading army. The United States wants peace, one that is just and lasting, and that is precisely why we are standing shoulder to shoulder with the victims with Ukraine, end quote. So really going after Hungary there again for calling for a ceasefire, for calling for peace. I think it's very revealing of what the U.S. agenda really is. In February, Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, he called for a ceasefire, and he's called for a ceasefire several times. And he said this was, again, in February, he wrote on Twitter, quote, Russia cannot win because the entire Western world has lined up behind Ukraine. At the same time, Russia is a nuclear power, and a nuclear power cannot be cornered because that may trigger a nuclear war. We need ceasefire and peace talks. The sooner, the better. Ukraine is fighting valiantly, and they have our full sympathy. But the only thing that can save lives in the Ukraine war is a ceasefire, end quote. So even that call for a ceasefire, I mean, it's not like he's taking Russia's side or anything. It's just really ridiculous the way that these U.S. officials react to things like that. And again, very revealing. So Pressman said that Budapest continuing to hinder dialogue between the North Atlantic Alliance and Ukraine is untenable. He said, quote, amidst a land war in Europe, consultations with our partner Ukraine are vitally important to our shared security as allies, and Hungary's policy of standing alone in an effort to block high-level meetings of the NATO-Ukraine Commission is untenable, end quote. And he said it will no longer be accepted. So Hungary takes issues with Ukraine's language laws that impacts the 150,000 Hungarians living in Ukraine. So they do have some issues with Ukraine. But this NATO-Ukraine Commission is this dialogue between NATO and Ukraine, and they have not met since 2019 because Hungary has blocked the meetings or objected to the meetings. But last month, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said that they're going to hold these meetings anyway, regardless of Hungary's protests. All right. So the next one here, Democrats attack Ukraine audit resolution as divisive and ill-advised. So this is another one from Kyle over at the Libertarian Institute. Legislation introduced by Representative Matt Gaetz, which calls on the White House to provide Congress with documents related to the war in Ukraine, passed a voice vote on Wednesday. And this is in the committee, in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And the resolution is set to be voted on by the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Friday. So they did this little voice vote, and apparently it got support from the Republicans in this committee, which is surprising to me. It's good, I think, because you have people like Michael McCall and all sorts of other hawks. And this is the bill that Gates introduced that would require President Biden and the Secretary of Defense to provide Congress, to provide the House with all documents related to U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, including, disclosing the number of U.S. troops there. And he introduced this after the leaks revealed, the U.S. Special Operations Forces are on the ground, something we already knew based on multiple media reports. But this is, it confirmed it. And now Gates is looking for more transparency. So it's good that the other Republicans support it. But of course, the Democrats are really going against it here. And this is again, though, this was just a voice vote. So when it comes to actually tallying a vote in this committee, it's not definitely clear that it's going to pass. But anyway, so Representative Kathy Manning, she's a Democrat in North Carolina. She blasted the resolution as divisive and ill-advised. She said, quote, it is a partisan political ploy and the height of legislative irresponsibility that jeopardizes the national security of the United States, of our European allies and partners, as well as the courageous people of Ukraine, end quote. And of course, she said, it plays into Putin's hands. Putin's going to love this bill, all that usual nonsense. So again, though, who knows? Maybe this thing will actually make it to a full House vote. All right. The next one here, the UK confirms that depleted uranium ammunition is in Ukraine. So British Armed Forces Minister James Heappey, he has confirmed that Ukraine received the controversial depleted uranium from the UK for use with its British-made Challenger 2 tanks. So he said in a response to a question from a Scottish MP, quote, we have sent thousands of rounds of Challenger 2 ammunition to Ukraine, including depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds, end quote. So this MP also asked if the UK was keeping track of how many depleted uranium rounds Kiev was using. Uh, he declined to say. He said, "quote For operational security reasons, we will not comment on Ukrainian usage rates for the rounds provided." End quote. He also confirmed that the depleted uranium rounds are now, they're under the control of Ukraine's armed forces, and he said that they're not going to monitor where they're used. He said, quote, "The Ministry of Defense does not monitor the locations where DU rounds are fired by the AFU in Ukraine," end quote. So depleted uranium is typically created as a byproduct of producing enriched uranium, and it is extremely dense, making it an effective material to pierce tank armor. So, since these munitions are radioactive, it's a low level of radiation, but they're still radioactive. They are linked to cancer and birth defects, especially in Iraq, where the US used a whole lot of them. There's still birth defects today in Fallujah, I know, because there's these accounts online, the hospitals that keep track of them, horrific birth defects that the babies don't have a chance of surviving. So that's still going on, but the UK is sending these, and Russia previously warned that it would treat the use of depleted uranium in Ukraine the same as a dirty bomb. The UK ignored the Russian warnings. They first confirmed in March that they were going to send these munitions, and in response, Putin announced that he would deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. And it was also, he said it himself that sending nukes to Belarus was something they were talking about for a while. Lukashenko wants it. They were helping convert Belarus's planes to drop nuclear weapons, but he kind of used the depleted uranium as a pretext to do so. So the U.S. could have also sent depleted uranium munitions. We don't know. The Bradley fighting vehicles can use them, but when the White House was asked if the Bradleys have arrived in Ukraine with the depleted uranium, they refused to say. I tried to ask the Pentagon, never heard back from them, which is pretty typical when I try to ask them things. All right. So the next one here, this is another one from Kyle, and it's about another controversial type of weapon. Republicans push Biden to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. So more pressure from the Republicans on this. So two leading GOP congressmen renewed calls for the White House to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. Representative Mike Rogers said that the U.S. has 3 million of the controversial munitions that will have to be destroyed if they are not sent to Kiev. So, I mean, just that line of thinking, we have to destroy them, might as well go give them all to Ukraine so they could be used to bomb people. So Rogers, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, issued the demand during a committee meeting on Wednesday. A cluster bomb is a munition that explodes and drops sub-munitions, small bomblets. If you see the picture, this is an older version, but you could see the little bombs that are in there. And they often do not explode and kill civilians decades into the future. After the Vietnam War, as many as 20 million bomblets remained unexploded on the ground in Laos. Thousands of children have been killed and injured when stumbling upon the unexploded submunition. So a very dark history of the U.S. use of these bombs. Rogers argues that it makes sense for the U.S. to ship the cluster bombs to Ukraine. Otherwise, the U.S. will have to pay for their destruction. He said, quote, "The U.S. military has over 3 million cluster munitions that can be fired by 155 millimeter howitzers in Ukraine's possession. We are going to spend millions of dollars destroying them if we don't use them, and Russia is using them right now against the Ukrainians," end quote. And there's also, Ukraine has used them as well. Ukraine used them in the Donbass way back in 2014 when that war first broke out. But cluster munitions are banned by over 100 countries. There's a treaty, although the US, Russia, and Ukraine are not signatories to that treaty. All right. So I just want to take this moment to mention again that it is our fundraiser. And at the top of our page today, we have our nice blurb from John Mearsheimer, the foreign policy expert, considered the dean of the Realist School of Foreign Policy, who has been a very important voice in these times, explaining how the U.S. and NATO and the West in general provoked this war in Ukraine. And he wrote a nice endorsement for us. So you could go to antiwar.com/donate, and you could see all the different ways that you could help us out. A one-time donation, monthly donation, special donation. You could always call the phone. Angela Keaton is usually They're ready to talk to you. If you want to do that, you could donate by mail, and then there's Bitcoin and PayPal, all these different ways that you can help us out. And we really appreciate any sort of support. If you can only spare $5, that makes a big difference. A lot of small donations like that, anything. And if you can't manage it, sharing the fundraiser, telling your friends about antiwar.com, that all really helps us out too. This is how we get by, entirely reader funded. And we're up against a lot. We have a very small staff, and your donations go straight to keeping the site running. It's very efficient. Antiwar.com. We run on a very small budget. But all right, back to the news here. The next one, where was I here? Oh, leaks show that Russia can keep funding the Ukraine war. So leaked U.S. military documents show the U.S. believes Russia will be able to continue funding its war in Ukraine for at least another year, despite Western sanctions. And this was the Washington Post reported on this. And this is based on what they say is one of the documents allegedly released by Jack Teixeira. So according to the Post, the leaked documents show that Ukraine's economic elite are unlikely to withdraw support from Putin, even if they don't agree entirely on the actions in Ukraine and have taken a hit from U.S. sanctions. So this sounds like it's an intelligence assessment. It reads, quote, Moscow is relying on increased corporate taxes, its sovereign wealth fund, increased imports and businesses' adaptability to help mitigate economic pressures, end quote. So these documents were marked with a code that suggests the intelligence was gathered by intercepting private conversations held by Russians, maybe Russian businessmen, Russian officials, on limiting the impact of sanctions. So Russia's economy did definitely take a hit from the Western sanctions and from a lot of Western companies leaving Russia. But Moscow has, shielded itself from the U.S.-led campaign. It's been able to keep its currency strong, and its energy exports, have continued to flow. So in the early days of the invasion, President Biden bragged that sanctions turned the Russian ruble into rubble, but then it bounced back. It went way up. It was one of the strongest performing currencies in 2022. It went back down a bit, but right now the level, it's about at the same level as it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And Russia has also found new markets for its oil in Asia, and its oil revenue has continued to soar despite the G7 attempts to place a price cap on Russian crude. The U.S. is pushing other G7 nations. The next step that they want to do is ban all exports to Russia, but that's facing pushback from the EU and Japan. So the G7 oil price cap thing, they're not enforcing it on India. They're not enforcing it on shipments to Asia. Russia's figured out ways to work around it. It's really kind of just a symbolic thing. Japan has an exemption. The European countries aren't buying seaborne oil from Russia anymore. But the countries like Hungary and Slovakia that are landlocked are still buying oil via pipeline. But that's exempted from the Russian oil ban, and the price cap is only, again, seaborne oil. So it's really just a whole lot of symbolism, and Russia's figuring out how to work around it. All right, the next one here. Russia takes control of 2 Western firms in a retaliatory move. So Putin signed an order on Wednesday that gives Russia temporary control over Russian subsidiaries of 2 Western energy firms. And this was a response to the U.S. and the EU freezing Russian assets. So the order, it froze the assets of a Finnish and German energy companies, 2 of them. And the Kremlin warned that the action could be expanded to take control of more assets. So since Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies, they've frozen hundreds of billions of dollars that belong to Russia's central bank and more than $58 billion that belongs to sanctioned Russians. The U.S. has actually seized some of this money, just taken it outright and transferred it to Ukraine. So far, they've done 5.4 million they've transferred to Ukraine, but they're looking to do more. And it looks like Russia might retaliate more by seizing more Western assets. And Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said this order is just temporary. They're not taking the assets and using them or spending them, but he's warning that they could take further measures in response to more sanctions. It seems like they want to use this as leverage to get the U.S. and get the West to roll back some sanctions. So we'll see. They might be doing more of this. All right, the next one here is a pretty big story. President Biden to send nukes to South Korea. So the US will send nuclear armed submarines to South Korea for the first time since the 1980s in a significant escalation that will raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula and risk provoking a response from Pyongyang. So these nuclear armed submarines will dock in South Korea, because there's the nature of these subs. They could be floating around, not floating around. They could be under the waters near South Korea. Nobody really knows where the U.S. nuclear armed submarines are, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, that they could really be anywhere in the world. But this is they're going to dock in South Korea. They're going to make a public show of it. It's very, very provocative. And the deployment is part of an agreement announced by President Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, who is currently visiting Washington. They met, they announced some new cooperation. So the US previously had nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea, but withdrew them in 1991. So again, this is big. US officials said that these nuclear armed submarines will only visit South Korea and that the US won't permanently deploy nukes to the country. But under this deal, the temporary deployment of US strategic assets to the peninsula will become much more frequent. The US and South Korea have also agreed to increase cooperation on nuclear weapons by forming a consultative group. According to the New York Times, the US will give South Korea a role in strategic planning for the use of nuclear weapons in any conflict with North Korea. In exchange, South Korea has agreed not to pursue building its own nuclear weapons. Yoon previously flirted with the idea, making him the first South Korean leader to suggest Seoul could develop nukes in 1991. Since 91, sorry. The agreement comes as there's no sign of the tensions on the Korean Peninsula easing. The US and South Korea continue to conduct massive war games, while Pyongyang has launched a huge number of missile tests and is warning that it can develop more nuclear weapons. So Yoon took office last year and vowed to take a harder line against North Korea than his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, who favored Korean reunification. And this has kind of culminated into this. And Biden is giving him everything he wants. He wants to enlist South Korea against China. So he seems to just, be giving him everything he asked for. And so, again, I mean, how is North Korea going to respond to this? Maybe they're going to do a nuclear weapons test, or something like that. We don't know what they're going to do. So it's just so unnecessary, this situation. The U.S. there's no possible benefit for just stoking tensions there when, if the U.S. backs down and offers some sanctions relief, they could enter a dialogue with North Korea. That's what they need to do, is talk. But there's no sign that that's going to happen. So there you go. Just looks like there's escalations everywhere, all around the world. All right, the next one here. Taiwan has an intelligence sharing link with Five Eyes. So a Taiwanese national security official said Wednesday that the island now has a real-time intelligence sharing link with the Five Eyes, which that's a Western intelligence alliance that includes the U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Britain. So Tsai Ming-yen, he's the Director General of Taiwan's National Security Bureau. He made the comments during a legislative hearing. He confirmed that Taiwan had been upgrading its computer systems to be able to share information with the Five Eyes nations. He said that they can connect with the Five Eyes through a confidential encrypted system. The comments are the latest example of Taiwan's growing relationship with the US and its allies. And of course, this cooperation angers Beijing. So also on Wednesday, Taiwan's defense ministry said that its upcoming military exercise will focus on breaking a blockade. I think, that's because when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan back in August 2022, China responded by simulating a blockade. They actually closed off 6 areas around the island. And then when McCarthy met with Tsai, they did something similar, not as extensive, but something similar. So now Taiwan is preparing for breaking a blockade. And I think a lot of the war planning in Washington is going to be also focused on that. Because I think it did open a lot of eyes, mine included, that because, a full-scale invasion of Taiwan would be a huge undertaking, but, they could blockade it, as they showed in these drills, very quickly and close down the Taiwan Strait. If they could do that instead of launching the full invasion. So Again, and that could happen so quick. So what would the US do? Would they start trying to sink Chinese ships? Who knows? But it's all very dangerous stuff. So these drills, anyway, in Taiwan, they're going to hold the tabletop version, which will be held in May, and then live fire exercises from July 24th to the 28th. And again, that's going to be simulating breaking the blockade. All right, the next one here. Turkey says that the condition for leaving Syria is the end of the YPG threat. So a Turkish official has said that they will pull out of Syria once there is, no threat from the YPG, which is part of the SDF, which is the Kurdish group that the U.S. backs in eastern Syria. The comments came after Syrian and Turkish officials held talks in Moscow on Tuesday as part of a Russian effort to broker a normalization deal between Damascus and Ankara. Syrian officials have said normalizing ties hinges on a Turkish withdrawal. So this Turkish official said, discussing these talks, it sounds like he said, quote, Turkey reiterated its previous arguments, which were laid out in the past 4 meetings in Moscow. The condition of the Turkish army's withdrawal from Syria would be with the end of the YPG threat, and that the regime and its allies should contribute to the resolution, end quote. So after the talks on Tuesday, the Syrian Defense Ministry said that a Turkish withdrawal was discussed during the meeting. This Turkish official denied that claim, but he kind of contradicted himself as well, saying that Turkey reiterated its position on a withdrawal. I guess they took it as them saying that they were actually negotiating a withdrawal, that it might happen soon. I don't know, but it does sound like they talked about it based on both comments. So anyway, so no breakthroughs were made in these talks, but there were some points that they went back and forth on. That Russia, or I forget which side, said that they discussed normalization, and Syria said, no, we didn't discuss normalization because withdrawal, that can't happen without withdrawal, which we did discuss. And then Turkey says, no, we didn't discuss that. But then they say they told them their conditions for a withdrawal. So I don't know. It kind of gives me the sense that this is going to take some time, this deal between Turkey and Syria, which isn't surprising, again, because the Turks went so hard, against Assad, and they do still occupy northern Syria. All right, but that is it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from George Beebe, Time for Biden to Come Clean on Ukraine, and that's over at Responsible Statecraft. We have one from James Bovard, Biden's atrocious Assange persecution. That's over at the Future Freedom Foundation. One from William L. Anderson, Arbitrary Use of Power, Punishing Those Who Expose Not So Secret Government Secrets. That's over at the Mises Institute. We have one from Caitlin Johnstone at her website, or her Substack. The Defense Review binds Australia to the U.S. war agenda. So that's about that Australian Defense Review that I went over the other day from the perspective of an Australian who's not too happy about it. And then one from Ted Galen Carpenter, Bombing Journalistic Integrity. And that's over at the American Conservative. He has been very prolific lately, Ted, and he's going to be writing for us a lot. So we're all very happy about that. But that is it for me for today. Again, help us out, antiwar.com/donate, share it around. I got to get better at trying to do this fundraiser. I got to start tweeting about it more and all that. But also like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Share the show. If you listen to the audio version, leave a review. That really helps. But that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.